Hi there, everyone. Earlier this week, I was privileged to be able to have a conversation with Chris Thompson. Chris Thompson is one of the main organisers and developers of the Betaflight project, and he was kind enough to take me through a lot of the changes that are coming up in 4.3, and they're major, amazing changes, a lot of them, and also give some tips on how you can tune 4.3 to make it fly even better for you. This is quite a long interview. Chris is an absolute fountain of knowledge about Betaflight, and there was just so much amazing content that I honestly couldn't cut the interview any shorter than it is without missing out on some of those real pearls of wisdom. So it's quite a long interview. Please make use of the timestamps down in the video description to home in on the bits that you're most interested in, or just sit back, relax, and enjoy listening to Chris talk about Betaflight. He's a really engaging, lovely individual, and I really hope that you enjoy listening to this interview as much as I enjoyed making it. I'll hand over to Chris now.
Okay, well, hi, Chris. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you at the moment. Betaflight's obviously an open source project with an awful lot of contributors. I'm just one of a whole bunch of really excellent people. And Betaflight 4.3 has been a long time coming because with COVID, a lot of people got sort of taken out or changed their interests. And as always in a group endeavor, people have different ideas and different ways of looking at things. And I'm sure everyone who follows this sort of thing knows that there was some internal conflicts and disagreements, and all of those things have been resolved, I think, reasonably well. And we don't have some people around that we had around. We have a whole bunch of new people. And with all of the different ways of thinking, I think we've been able to make a really fantastic release that we're all very excited about. Just took a lot longer than we intended. My role has kind of become a sort of an organizer, I suppose, trying to keep the project moving, trying to inspire people, trying to have a vision of making really great software. And personally, I race and I do cinematic videos, and I just fly for fun. You know, I've always loved going down to a park and having a nice sunset or something like that and flying around through some trees and just the simple pleasure of flying. And I love race days. And I've tried really, really hard to make it so that the firmware works incredibly well. Not just okay, but just fantastically. And I think we've got, you know, really close now. It's beautiful to fly. Every time I go out and fly, I think, wow, this is so much better than I am.
I think it's a credit to everything that you and the other developers and contributors to the project have achieved, that so many people are so excited about 4.3 that they really can't wait to try it. And I think probably more people than ever before are running the nightly builds and taking advantage of these new features. And really, they can't wait for the full release candidate. So I think that really communicates to me, at least, the excitement about this new version of the firmware and about the new updates and improvements that it brings. So I'd love to ask you a few questions about these new improvements, and for really to get your opinion and for you to talk us through everything that's new and awesome in Betaflight 4.3. So I wanted to start with the new PID-based tuning sliders that have changed a lot since 4.2. Can you talk us through those and how you hope they're going to improve the tuning experience for pilots?
Okay. Well, I think the first thing I want to say is that they're not my idea. We had tuning sliders in 4.2, and I didn't personally find them all that suitable for the way I tune things. And so I didn't really use them very much. And we had a bunch of meetings, mostly with Mark Spatz and Brian White and a whole bunch of guys who are active pilots. And we really wanted to get to the bottom of how we could do them best. And the original name of the tuning sliders was simplified tuning. And the idea was to make it easier for people. So then instead of having to type in a bunch of little numbers that kind of didn't mean very much, we would have a center value that represented a pretty good value for most machines. And when you shifted it one way or the other, you get yourself into a place that might modify a characteristic in a sensible way. And we probably argued and discussed and chatted and brainstormed for, I think probably about 2 months, really trying to nut out how we would do it. And in the end, we've kind of gone back pretty much to a traditional, PI, D, feed forward type of slider set, because in the end, that's what we think works best. And it means that for an ordinary user, you've got to come to grips with P and I and D, at least to some extent. But I think we've made it pretty straightforward. We've given nice, simple, plain English names for what they tend to do. Good tooltips that explain if you move this slider to the right, kind of what to expect and whatnot. And a person can experiment with them. More importantly, you don't have to just do it on the computer. You can plug into the OSD and adjust each slider in your on-screen display or with Lua and through your radio. So it's quite easy to tweak your tune in the field. You don't have to sit there and go up and down by 5 on this one and that one. And it changes all channels. So if you bring your P slider up, it'll drag both pitch and roll up nice and simply. And I think it's also true to say that we've modified the actual default PIDs just a little bit. And so out of the box, in the middle's pretty good. I'm sure you'd agree for most things.
Absolutely. I mean, my opinion on the sliders with 4.3 is that you've managed to provide a set of sliders that allow a few different tuning approaches all to be accomplished really, really easily. And I know that yourself and some others have a sort of D first tuning approach where you'll use the D slider and then the P and I slider. And I do a slightly different approach where I use the master slider, taking full advantage actually of what you said, which is the fact that the P and the D values, the ratio of them is usually really good from the start, because the defaults are really good. And the fact that you can do either method using the sliders that are available in 4.3, I think is fantastic.
I think also it's kind of tough if there's a whole lot of sliders. So we have an expert mode where there's only 3 of them, and you can have a look at them and just tweak the main things. And each one does something. You'll feel it if you move it. Yeah. You'll hear it, you'll feel it, you'll know what it does. So it makes it a whole lot simpler for a person who wants to experiment with them to adjust them. And if you click the expert mode, you can really fine tune the balance of the quad between pitch and roll, and whether you have a lot of I or a bit less I. And yeah, you can tune it the Mark Spatz's way or Brian White's way or Ross's way or any of these guys who've got videos out to guide you through how to do it. And I'm pretty sure you and others will come out with videos using the sliders and explaining how to use them. And that's great. So we're kind of in a partnership with all of these guys, even though there's a lot of sort of differences between the various methods. In the end, it's what you come up with and how the thing flies. And I hope, and we hope anyway, that we provided a tool set for people who like tuning and people who would like to learn about it, so they can get where they want to go.
Yeah, absolutely. As I said, I think it's phenomenal how you've been able to support, as you say, all these different approaches, make them all work and make them easy for people. And also, really we're moving towards this sort of ratiometric tuning where we're controlling the ratios between the terms in a really intuitive way. So as you say, people can move one slider and feel the difference. I think it's awesome.
And if you want to turn feed forward off, you can slide the feed forward slider all the way to the left and see what that feels like.
and the same for Dmin as well. You can go down to 0 on a couple of the key sliders that people would often want to turn off, either as part of their tuning or to see what it feels like when it flies.
There is a couple of things I'd like to mention about them.
Sure.
The first is that there's always going to be a concern that someone has about what happens to the numbers. So the way they work is very complicated, and right now there's a lot changing. So if people out there are seeing this video after 4.3 is released, it should be all stable. But we have to match the firmware in the quad with the tool that's adjusting the PIDs. And so consequently, you have to think about it a little bit. And basically, if you just work with the sliders, it's very, very simple. But if you start to want to mess with the numbers at the same time, you could run up with something that doesn't quite match up. And I very strongly recommend that people use the sliders to tune. I use them, and they're fantastic. It's so much quicker to get a working tune or to get it to 99% right with very little effort. And yeah, so I would really strongly recommend people ditch the old type it in numbers and have a play with them. I think you'll enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly I haven't gone back. I now tune with the sliders as well, just because it's so much easier.
Okay.
Talking more about some of these features to make things easier for pilots. The next major feature I think we have to talk about is presets. Presets in 4.3. Do you want to talk us through what presets are, how they work, and what benefits they bring?
I'm probably not the right man to speak to. The man who's got to take really all of the credit for them. There are two people, Illusion FPV and later picked up by Lemon or Ivan Efimov. And between mostly Ivan has done the hard work. We had some early concepts, but he really put it all together, and we spent a lot of time talking, he and I, and it sounds really simple. The simple idea was you'd have some way where you could get a dump out of the CLI or some settings out of Betaflight and just put them somewhere, and someone can press a button and put them in. It's actually really hard. So when you look at the detail we went to try to make the presets work really well, it's massive, and it's a huge amount of credit, you know, to Lemon for his work. It's really fantastic. So the idea really is that we will, within the Betaflight configurator, make it very easy for people to grab a preset that covers either a tune or a VTX setup or a receiver setup, or a tune for an unusual type of quad, a big quad or a little quad, a race quad or a cinematic quad or whatever, and grab that and have some confidence that it'll work, because we have an approval process. So you can't just put on any old tune up that you like. We check them and we make sure they work really well. And so we have a set of official tunes that are hosted by Betaflight with a rather complicated and difficult approval process. And there are options that we can put into any tune. So you can have a tune that's set up to work for a particular type of receiver and maybe have an option for different link speeds, for instance. Or if you're using a certain type of receiver for a certain type of purpose, you could have an option that said, I want to use this receiver for racing, as opposed to using this setup for cinematic purposes. So a lot of the presets have options that allow the user to really home in on exactly what they want them to do. And we have warnings which alert people if they need to enable RPM filtering, and that's pretty important, because some tunes and some filter setups really have to have RPM filtering on. So yeah, so that's the basics of it. But you know, Ivan's gone further than that. We've included in it a very simple button that lets you save your current setup, so that you can back it up and you can pull it back and put it back.
Right.
And that's pretty important if you're going to flash someone else's tune on top of your machine, so that we can very quickly, you can get yours back. And also he set it up so that an individual can host their own server and store presets of their own, so that you can follow a link. And you know, Chris, you might set up your own. I'm not sure if you want to, but using our structure and our format, they will be indexed and they'll show up just as if you're using the Betaflight ones. And so an individual person could even set up their own server and store all of their own presets and just grab them and load them up and be confident that the way that quad's going to fly today will be exactly the way it flew 6 months ago when they had those settings in place. And we've made it so that it's version aware. So all of the current presets are 4.3 aware, but when we go to 4.4, if there's any changes, we'll be able to adjust the presets to say which firmware they'll work with and so on. So yeah, there's a lot of thought gone into it. He's done an amazing job.
As you say, it's a simple concept, allowing people to effectively just paste parts of the CLI dump into their version. But actually, yes, the amount of engineering that has to go into making that work in a way that both you can do and undo the presets in a sensible way is really awesome. I can't wait to use them in 4.3. And yes, I will definitely be making a few of my own, I'm sure, for my own use, and also providing them to people if they want to give them a go as well. So it's a really, really great feature.
The other thing that we've included is a discussion button, which goes to the GitHub account or the GitHub pull request from which the preset originally found its way into Betaflight.
Right.
And that's a method where you can provide feedback to the guys who put that preset together and say, look, why'd you do that? Or this is fantastic, or whatever you want to say. And we're encouraging people who are submitting presets to keep an eye on them, to monitor the feedback in their pull request so that there's a line to the people who develop them. And we may find over time that we'll optimize them slightly or make new versions that are slightly different or with a slightly different purpose. And we really are hopeful that, in a year's time, we'll have just a perfect tune for a particular type of whoop that a number of people have argued over, and they've ended up setting it up, and that just becomes just the best way to fly that. Because in Betaflight, we're not caring about how people use this firmware, but what we've got now is a tool that lets you put your launch control set up a certain way, or your thrust linear a certain way, or some particular combination of rates, or whatever you like. Set it up the way exactly you like it, and even apply it on some defined hardware if you like. And you can be sure it'll fly just the way you intend it to go. So I know you make frames, and if you add some hardware specification, you can then put the settings for that. And anyone who puts that together, it'll fly just like the one you got on the wall there. That's the idea.
That would be fantastic. Certainly, yes, I can see myself and other people who make bind and flies, making sure those presets are available so that people get the most out of the frames. Because like you say, it's particularly for someone like myself, my frames fly best if you tune them quite aggressively. So having a preset that allows people to put that tune on the quad, it's going to make things so much easier for people to get their quads flying brilliantly. If we move on now and talk about a little bit more something under the hood, maybe things that people wouldn't be so aware of. A lot of changes in 4.3 have revolved around the loop timing and scheduler and DMA code improvements. Can you give us a little bit of a background on why these changes are important and what benefits they're providing to pilots, even though they're sort of very low level under the hood changes?
Okay. One of the things that a lot of people have said about 4.3 that we really love to hear is that it's easy to tune. And it is. It's got quite a wide tuning envelope. I think 4.1 in particular was very fussy, and 4.2 still is a little bit. 4.3, you can shift the P's and PI and D values up quite a lot further than I recall ever being able to comfortably do before. Up or down, you'll get some differences, but the thing won't go berserk quite so easily. And sometimes a soft tune works really well. Now, and above all else too, your motors just don't seem to be as hot or angry as they used to be. And a large part of that is because we've done perhaps maybe 10 really important changes to the way the firmware works. So Steve Evans has just been a fantastic guy, and he's looked really hard at, as you said, the underpinnings within the microcontroller architecture and the finding out which bits of the firmware take the most time, how to sync the gyro to the flight controller so that as soon as the data is ready, it comes straight in, and trying to make it so that this happens absolutely at clockwork, exactly on time. And that means the filters work better, because otherwise, if the filter shifts either side just by some small percentage, you get a little wobble in the outgoing signal to the motors. And so that's been really, really, really important. And doing that was very difficult because I have to reschedule a lot of things that happen under the hood, and that introduced some bugs, and we found a whole bunch of bugs, and we caused a whole bunch of bugs. And that's partly what's delayed the release of the firmware, is that if you're going to rebuild all of the underpinnings, well, that's a lot of work.
It's like underpinning a building, isn't it? You know, when you underpin a building, it's a huge job because of how much is built on top of all that code.
So way over my head, I couldn't take any credit at all for it. I just can't follow what he's doing at all. But he's a very modest guy and just a genius, and it's absolutely fantastic that we have him, you know, working with us. And so that's one part of it. We've also got, you know, a really, really, really clever man called Jan Post, and he is, I think, a filter genius, you know, to be quite honest. And so he understands filters really well, and he's done some wonderful work improving the dynamic notch filter. And also, sort of fortuitously, we realized how notch filters work. Now that might sound really silly, but notch filters don't work like we thought they worked. And once we understood that, there was a little bit of a flash of insight as to how we could actually attenuate the RPM filters away in a much better fashion and cross them over in terms of the way the RPM filter comes on and comes off in a way that really markedly reduces delay and lag at low to medium RPM. So the RPM filtering is now a whole lot better. The dynamic notch filtering is a whole lot better. The timing of everything is a whole lot better. And the end result of all of that is that, you know, the current Betaflight filtering setup that we've got now, even in 4.3, is really, really, really forgiving. You can fly all kinds of bad quads, and the stock filters just eat it up. And there's a lot of room on the upside that we never had before. So that, you know, I think I'd be inclined personally to change the defaults if I could. But what I really mean is that all of these technical changes have made it so that we get a lot more out of the firmware than, you know, than we ever had before. And there are other things that we changed in it, that there's a lot of things in Betaflight where, for instance, your throttle position or your throttle movement will alter some other parameter. So anti-gravity, you move the throttle and you get, for rapid throttle changes, a boost in P or I, so that the quad will be more stable and won't sort of bob the nose up and down when you accelerate or decelerate. And there's quite a lot of things like that, like dynamic idle and the dynamic filtering. All of those things assume that the incoming data is smooth and even, but actually it's not. So we went to an awful lot of trouble. I particularly went to a lot of trouble to get all of that smoothing right. So the control signals within Betaflight and the RC signals coming in from the radio are really optimally smoothed, so that they don't sort of print through an extra layer of noise into the works. And so the end result of it all, it's a whole lot cleaner than it ever was. All of these modulation things don't add extra noise now, and we're very confident about that. So when you put all of that stuff together, it kind of explains why it's a completely different experience from 4.2 in terms of tolerating bent props or bad setups. And that's allowed us to bring the PIDs a little bit higher by default, definitely to bring D a bit higher by default, and to bring the default filters up a bit higher, and still have a lot of leeway to go up.
I know that a lot of people will be, you know, interested to know exactly how the SFDT, the new dynamic notch filter, and how the RPM crossfading work. maybe we could talk to Jan about it in another at another time, maybe, because I imagine he would
yeah,
be
I
the
think
best
he's the
person.
man to talk to about it. But one of the really fascinating things is that the way our notch filters seem to work is that they build up a signal that's an exact opposite of the signal they're trying to get rid of.
Right.
They actually generate an anti-signal, and that signal has a come on and come off time. So the RPM filters are the perfect application for a notch filter because in general, the motors can't change RPM instantaneously. They do it smoothly. So as they change frequency, the anti-signal that nulls out the noise coming at that frequency can move with it. And also we know exactly what that frequency is. Now, if however, you were just to suddenly stop the motor instantaneously, what would actually happen would be that the notch filter would have an echo of their cancelling out signal that would persist in time. And you can imagine if the noise could abruptly shift frequency, we'd have exactly the same problem.
Yeah.
We would have an echo of the initial frequency, and then we wouldn't block it initially at the new frequency.
Yeah.
So all of our notch filters must track or follow something that's consistently there. And they've got to track it kind of smoothly and gradually. So it turned out that it's not easy to make these things fantastic. It's very easy to put a notch filter on 50 hertz mains noise and dial it up to the exact right amount and just cancel it out. That's fine because that's going all the time. But everyone knows that our resonant frequencies will come on quickly and then vanish, or the RPM, it's going to shift up or down, and modern motors can change RPM pretty quickly. So that was actually what was revolutionary, was learning how to tune the timing of the entry of the filter and the offset of the filter, and it depended on the Q setting. So we've optimized them, and you could talk for hours on it. And I think in the end, what we tried to do is pick values that work very well. And Jan has optimized the new dynamic notch so that it handles all this stuff really well, and it works fantastically. Now we may have some improvements possibly in the future, but he's got it to at least the 95-98% level now, and at least a good sort of twice as good as before. It's really remarkable, and so a lot of credit to him for hours and hours and hours of work and testing, and all of the guys who tested it to take flights, make logs, and find out exactly what it's doing. So yeah, that's really exciting. All of that stuff, all of the filtering now works a whole lot better. And, and I know that the end result is that guys like yourself at Mark are now encouraging people to use only one gyro filter or none. And a lot of quads now can do that quite happily.
Absolutely.
I don't like that. I think you should keep one on. All of my quads, they got bent props and stuff like that. So I keep one on. And one quick word is always keep low pass 2 on. If you're going to have just one of them, keep low pass 2 on, because low pass 2 runs in the gyro loop, right, at gyro speed, and it acts as an anti-aliasing filter. Because if your PI, especially if the PID loop is running slower than the gyro loop, and for a lot of whoops, a lot of F4 boards, you want to run them at 4K, there's going to be an aliasing problem. So it's low pass 2 that is an anti-aliasing filter. If you turn it off, we stick a 2-point moving average filter in, which isn't much good at anything and just adds delay, but we have to put something there. Otherwise the aliasing problem would be massive. So yeah, if you're going to have a filter, make it low pass 2. And I would encourage you to keep it on at 1,000 or something personally. You can take them all off if it's a really clean quad and you look after it, and that'll be fine actually on a lot of builds. So I'm sure you did. I don't know, what do you recommend now?
Well, I would say that if you're running 8K PID loop, then I would recommend no gyro filtering. If you're running a 4K PID loop, I would recommend gyro low pass 2 at 1,000 hertz. And there's just one exception to that rule, which is that there's a gyro called the BMI 270, the Bosch gyro. And my understanding is that for the Bosch gyro, that its hardware low pass inside the gyro is at a much higher frequency than the hardware low pass filter in the MPU gyros. And so I would also advise, if you're running a BMI 270 a Bosch gyro, which some of the new iFlight Beast boards have, that again you keep probably gyro low pass 2 on at somewhere around 250 to 300 hertz to effectively replicate the low pass filter that you would have in the MPU gyro. But my understanding is doesn't exist in the same way in the Bosch gyro. They have a low pass filter, they do, but it's up at 700 hertz or more for whatever reason.
We've never really known what the details of the hardware low pass filter in the MPU chips is, but I think it's a second order filter. Right. So yeah, like a second order filter, like a biquad or a PT2 type filter at 250 hertz on gyro. If it's noisy or you're having problems, I do that. If it's not noisy and the motors aren't hot, then yeah, first order like a PT1 at 250. Yeah, that's what you'd probably want to put in. And yeah, that's probably what you have to do for them. Sometimes more. They can be quite noisy. Yeah.
And yes, for the F4s, definitely a low pass 2 at 1000 hertz. Very important for anti-aliasing, as you say.
If you're going to race, or if you're going to fly old hardware, 500 hertz single PT1, that'll handle most things. Well, what you can't do is get all quick on the D low pass filtering.
Yes,
you want to move that up and you'll burn things real fast. So I think my advice to probably 99% of people is you can ease the D filters up 1 or 2 clicks and maybe get away with that. But if you want to move them up real high, D is really aggressive now. We've got D up a bit higher. There's not a lot of headroom there. So yeah, and nor is there a lot of benefit, to be quite honest. Moving the D low pass filter up a little bit higher takes a tiny bit of delay out of D.
But it's only fractions of a millisecond for most quads. So yeah, I would agree. It's not as big a deal as turning off some other filters or setting up cutoffs up at 1000 hertz.
And I know that we've had a lot of discussions about the nature of the best D filter setup to use, and I don't think at this point Betaflight's comfortable to move away from what we've got, and we've messed around quite a lot with different other ones. So that's one thing we haven't changed in 4.3. We're sticking with the 75 to 150 hertz dynamic, varying depending on your throttle, with a fixed filter at 150 hertz. And that means you've got quite solid defiltering and consistent time delay. We're not using a very sophisticated filter in that application, and we know it works well. So yeah, we're pretty happy with it. And I've tried a whole bunch of other things, and we've included PT2 and PT3 filters, which are kind of gives you the potential to have a whole lot of filtering if you like.
Yes.
And no matter how I messed around with them on D, I couldn't get any better for my liking. You can certainly use a biquad as well, a single biquad, or a fixed single biquad, or a movable biquad, or a movable PT2 or PT3. And I spent a couple of days playing with all of them. In the end, just shrugged my shoulders and said, the old way we got it's pretty good. So, but I think that's something where I'm not sure it's going to be like that forever, because the biquad definitely does have an application on D. It's a very hard cutting filter, and it's got a good bandpass region. So it may be that we get a bit more experience with that, or a bit more feedback with that, and that we might change that in future. But that hasn't changed at all. And in fact, the basics of the filtering hasn't changed in 4.3. It's just that, they're all still the same filters, but they work 10 times better, 5 times better. They just work. They've been unleashed.
Absolutely. I mean, I've recommended in my filter tuning video for 4.3, I've talked people through both the karate filter setup with the dynamic PT1 and the static PT1 at 70 to 150, and then a static at 150, which is, I think, the default. And I've also taught people through another configuration using a dynamic biquad. So I've covered both of those options that you suggest, and I would say that they are very similar in terms of performance. And if people are interested, they can watch that video where I cover the differences and pick which one they think is best for them, or try them both out and see which one flies better. But the next thing I wanted to talk about, and I think this is something that you've been involved quite heavily in, Chris, is looking at feedforward in 4.3, the jitter reduction, and you've already mentioned some of the work you've done on the RC smoothing. Can you talk us through those changes?
Yeah, sure. These are things that I've pretty much driven. It hasn't been easy, I'll say. As you know, I think in 4.2 there was a tendency to say, well, we should all turn off feedforward. And we had a thing called feedforward transition. And what that did was that if you did have feedforward on, it would sort of take it away when your stick was in the center position, around the middle. And as you moved out, it would gradually bring feedforward back in again. And that was actually very important for a lot of those pilots who do those beautiful, smooth, fluid sort of gentle turns and then snap out and flip around, and you'd see these fantastic videos with this incredibly crisp response, but it would be smooth in the middle.
Right.
And so they were not all using feedforward, but an awful lot of them were. That was the kind of key to it. Now, on the other hand, we had some people finding that feedforward just made the whole thing too edgy and all that sort of stuff. Feedforward is really a very complicated thing that goes right back to when D was originally calculated from error. So when D was calculated from error, which was how Betaflight 3.3 did it, and I go back a long way with Betaflight. I'm an old man and I've seen it for a long time. But back then we did it from error, and error includes not just the gyro movements, but your stick movements. So we had a D component that was tied to the stick movement. We didn't have any independent way of adjusting that stick component, okay? But it was there, it was always there. And it was good old Boris who started Betaflight, Boris B, who separated out the gyro element, which we now call D, from the stick element, which we now call feedforward. And at the time it had a different name, but we call it feedforward because it's kind of ahead of everything else in a sense. Now, but the point I'm trying to make is that people who say you should have no feedforward kind of don't understand control theory, if you ask me. Because feedforward is an inherent part of control theory where you have a moving set point, where you keep changing the set point. If you want to get there in some reasonable time frame, sometimes waiting for the error to be detected and then add it up and for things to respond to that error just takes a while.
Yeah, it's too slow.
I remember my son, who's been a great inspiration to me, and we were talking about these things, and he said, in a wonderful, simple way, he said, look, I don't really understand why, because we were flying radar control gliders and discus launch gliders and all that sort of stuff. And they're wonderful things, and they don't have flight controllers. You move the stick and the control surface moves a certain amount. He said, how come you can't have this thing when I move the stick, that those two motors on the left speed up just because you move the stick?
Yeah, right. To start that movement. Yeah.
Yes. Or to provide the guts of it. And of course, we didn't really have a model like that. We had a model that you move the stick and now all of a sudden you're not where you're supposed to be. So we're going to try to deal with that error. So it was a pure error correcting model. So that's what feedforward does. When you move the stick, feedforward makes the two motors that you want to move directly. They just start going straight away.
It pushes the quad into the move before any error has a chance to build up, so
That's
that
right.
the quad is able to follow your sticks absolutely precisely.
Yeah, and it turns out to be a lot more complicated than that, because the sticks are full of jitter and noise, so you've got to smooth them out. And I think that's been a very big thing here. We've now got a lot more knowledge, and we've got presets for different radio links that optimize the smoothing of the radio link and do that with the least delay. Also, though, if I'm flying a cinematic quad and I want to like really cruise, and I don't want to have microscopic little jitters every time I move the stick. I want to have the thing just flow into the turns, you know, just like that. Well, that requires certain smoothing of tiny jittery elements, and you want to go and get rid of them. So it gets very, very complicated and very, very difficult to smooth those things out. So RC smoothing has to match your radio link. It's very important that it matches. And in the past, nobody really kind of knew what to do. There was a couple of smart guys who would have looked it up, and people make tutorials and explain it. We're hoping that with the preset, you can choose Ghost at 500 and have it work okay. Or, you know, Crossfire locked at 50 and it'll work well too. And even better, you can choose one of them and say, I want it for cinematic purposes. And it will feel like it ought to feel like. It'll be a little bit slow for some slow movements, but if you go quickly, it'll build up really nicely. So we're now using third order filtering on the RC links, and that was the key to it. That's what made it much smoother. Third order filtering on a stepped, you know, like a radio signal comes in and suddenly it steps. It kind of does a perfect job smoothing it out. And it's very, very simple to operate. And you can dial up the amount of RC smoothing from our default number, which is 30, kind of like a PID number, you know, P's and D's are 30s. Yeah, if you bring it up to 60, it starts to get noticeably smooth. And by the time you get up to 90 or 120, you'll feel a real lag, but the machine will be like, I don't know, like it's on railroad tracks. It'll just get the smoothest, cruisiest feeling you could ever have. And you can now pretty reasonably expect to do stuff that's almost as smooth as a hyper smooth stabilized, you know, bit of footage just while you fly. It's unbelievable. So yeah, so the RC smoothing side is very, very important for that. But Feedforward gets even more aggressive, because Feedforward isn't the steps themselves, it's the change from one step to the next. And we discovered that a lot of radios have a lot of jitter, and a lot of radios weren't using the available steps very effectively, and Betaflight wasn't. So we had to change all the internal mathematics for how we handled radio signals, so that we didn't have aliasing problems and we had full float resolution. And we went back to the manufacturers, and in this whole of this last year almost, been dealing with TBS and various other people, Tony from Ghost and Alessandro from ELRS. And now I think we can confidently say that we've got the kind of smoothest transfer with the least delay possible for all of those links. And you don't really notice it until you fly it, you know, especially if you get a fast radio link, you know, 250 or 500, and our system will detect that very automatically. And with the defaults, you'll get this incredible feeling that I don't think I really experienced ever. I used to try to fly my Whoop around my house, and I just couldn't do it nearly as well as the guys in the videos. And now I have such a ball flying it around because it's so precise, you know. Anyway, so we did all of that. And then the feedforward is very, very complicated. But because feedforward reacts to how quickly the stick moves, I kind of had this idea, well, I always hated transition. I wanted to have a transition so that if I imagine I was doing a smooth arc in the sky, I didn't want my transition to only work when the quad was going straight ahead.
Yeah.
I wanted a kind of a smoothness and an absence of feedforward in an arc. And in fact, let's say I'm a racer and I'm doing a spiral down around something. I don't want the quad kind of moving around on that spiral. I want a perfectly smooth thing. So I don't want my nervousness or my little bit of shaking or my little bit of jumpiness or sticking in the gimbal. I don't want it flinging the thing around, because
No.
Feedforward says, well, you moved a real lot then, so now I'm going to
Yeah.
get you there.
Yeah.
So we had this kind of brainwave that we could attenuate feedforward based on how quickly the stick moves.
Mm.
And the idea being that when you're in the middle and you're just cruising around, or you're doing a smooth arc, the absolute amount of each little step per unit time that you're telling the quad to move is very small.
Mm.
And whenever that happens, we attenuate it. And we attenuate it in a range around that. And it's amazing. So you can now get this incredible smoothness, partly because the radio link is smoothed optimally, and partly because the feed forward element is smoothed optimally, and it's on by default. So you don't need to put transition on. Freestyle Pilot can pick up Betaflight 4.3, fly it out of the box, put a preset on for their link, and I think most people will just be amazed how it feels.
Yeah.
You can get the smoothness and you've got the snap. Some people might think, oh, there's a bit more snap than I like. Well, that's really easy. Go to the feed forward slider,
turn it down a little bit.
Back that off a bit. That's all you have to do.
I mean, what I recommend. I mean, I think that I completely agree. The feel of it's absolutely stunning. One of the great things about the RC smoothing I found is that if you want your quad to respond really aggressively to things like wind and prop wash and outside influences, you tend to push up the P and D and I gains higher, so that the quad is responding to prop wash more aggressively and holding itself more stable. And then that used to make the quad also very sensitive to your stick inputs as well. So it would kind of sometimes feel too twitchy. But with the RC smoothing, you can have the quad that's super tightly tuned to handle prop wash.
Exactly.
And then with RC smoothing, it's just so gentle on your sticks, and you can be super smooth. So you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get the super tightly tuned feel when you're in prop wash or when there's wind, but with that super smooth feel that you would typically expect from a soft tune. And so, I mean, that, you don't have to make any compromises.
Yeah, I mean, I get a big smile just going out and flying it myself. Not only for freestyle, but also for cinematic work. I think we're going to see the end of sort of Mavics for an awful lot of the type of interesting footage that we'll probably start seeing coming into advertisements and movies and stuff. Yeah. It'll all be shot with Betaflight, because you can dial up that RC smoothing and put a bit of jitter reduction on, and you get, provided the tune's all right and the whole thing is not shaking and you've got a reasonable camera mount, you can get just amazing results. I get amazing results that I never ever thought I would get, just down to little details. You used to, in 4.2, you put a GoPro on and you'd fire along and you were sure you were really smooth, but the thing would jump. You know what I mean? It would,
it would twitch in the air a little bit.
Yeah, and you'd swear, oh, next time I'll fly more smoothly, and you try really hard and you'd still see these little jumps, and then you dial off the the transition and stuff, and then the thing would just be dull and it didn't feel good anymore. So now with this, also racers can, on the opposite side of the spectrum, can have it so that even though they're nervous, the quad kind of tracks where they want it to track. It doesn't just slam itself into the gate all of a sudden just because you happen to make some input. And I gone to a lot of trouble with Feedforward to try to get it to follow a kind of the path that you're on, if you like. It's a bit hard to explain, but the machine's not really flying exactly what we tell it to do. The motors are speeding up and slowing down, and all the control systems are just a little bit off. It's always kind of adjusting itself all the time.
Yes.
And if you give it a jittery inputs and all that sort of stuff, it's going to start to move around in the sky. And race machines move around just a couple of feet sometimes that you weren't really intending.
Yeah.
So the problem before was that if we smoothed it out so that it went smoothly, it would feel really dull.
Yes.
But now it doesn't.
Laggy.
It's kind of amazing.
It is, yeah. And I'm very excited. I might have to get in touch with you again because I'm hoping to do a video on exactly everything about Feedforward and how to tune it. So I'll definitely be leaning on you for your input on some of that.
Well, I hope that the presets will help people, because we have two settings there that are worth messing with. The feedforward smoothing really has to be adjusted according to the RC link, and it'll sort of dull the whole thing down. So it's best left on defaults or brought up a little bit more as the RC link goes faster. So we have a default of something like 30. You need to bring it up to about 50 or something at 250 hertz, and for 500 hertz, it's got to come up a bit higher, because otherwise they're just too jittery. They're going very, very fast, so they don't have a lot of sort of resolution in terms of the amount of movement per step. So the feedforward smoothing has got to be kind of tuned a little bit in that regard, and the jitter reduction doesn't have to be tuned all that much. But if you wanted a hard or strong transition effect, you'd bring that up from its default of sort of 7, you might bring it up to 10 or 12. If you bring it up to 15 or 20, you're only going to get feedforward when you really slam the sticks.
Yeah.
It's kind of a hard thing. I didn't really know what name we should give it. It is a jitter reduction system, but it
also acts a bit like transition as well.
Yeah, it's a smoothing. It's like a dynamic transition that comes on wherever you happen to be. So you can be in the middle of the tightest spiral around a tree, and it's just going to smooth all that out, and it does. It's kind of wonderful.
Well, now we have to come on to one of my favorite Betaflight features, which is dynamic idle. And dynamic idle, I think, an underused, I would say, feature in Betaflight 4.2. But huge improvements in 4.3. Can you tell us a bit about what's changed on dynamic idle?
Well, again, this is something I really can't take any credit for. I'm really much more the kind of person who sits down and takes a lot of time to fine-tune things and improve them. So dynamic idle was written by Thorsten Larks or Joe Lucid, who did amazing things in the time that he was with us in Betaflight. And dynamic idle was a spin-off of knowing what the RPM of the motors was. And unfortunately, when he left, it was kind of half finished and half implemented, half sort of bonded in. And truthfully, nobody really understood it except Thorsten.
Yes.
So we have this thing in the code, and I don't think anybody really kind of got it. Not even me or anybody. And there were so many things that he added, and they caused so much conflict internally relating to the RPM filtering that he didn't get to finish them off. And I don't think also because people didn't quite get them, we didn't kind of even know what the place was. And it's taken me really almost 2 years to properly understand what it does and how to apply it. It's a bit like thrust linear and some of these things. They sound simple when someone describes them. So dynamic idle sounds really simple. What we're just going to do is say, look, we don't want a motor to stall. We don't want it to go so slow that it will stop. That's the whole idea of idle on your car or your lawnmower or anything like that. So if we know how fast they're turning, why don't we have some software that just says, no, you're not allowed to go slower than that. And as you drift down there, we're going to start to try to stop you. So Thorsten wrote some code that did that. And it worked pretty well. I'm not going to say it worked phenomenally well, but it worked very well. And I don't think anyone believed it could work, to be quite honest, because if you think about it, when you cut a motor, it's got wind blowing at it and it's going to fall down. How do you do that? So I looked at how he'd done the code and spent a lot of time trying to understand it and modified it. And it's now basically a highly modified PID controller. It's like a single-sided PID controller. So it uses D to look at how quickly the RPM is falling. And it has a p-value that looks at, well, I'm a little bit off, looks like error, like P, and tries to keep it where it's going to be. And it has an integral factor, which is really kind of weird, that builds up, and once it's high enough, it kind of keeps it there. So it's got a PID controller, but it's single-sided. And for most quads, you don't have to mess with it. But what that means is that if you know what the slowest motor is doing, the absolute slowest motor, you can bring the motor drive up, the signals to all of the motors, a bit like lifting your throttle a little bit,
Yeah.
so that that slowest motor can't stall or stop. In fact, so that it can't go below whatever RPM you tell it not to go below. Now, there was a long time ago, people had a thing called an idle up switch on their radios. So before we had air mode or any of that, so that you could flip and roll and keep your motors going, you'd have a switch. And once you got in the air, you'd hit the idle up switch and the throttle could never go below 20% or something like that. And that kept you just spinning and all that sort of stuff. And a lot of people did that. And then we ended up just having a fixed D-shot idle. So what fixed D-shot idle means is that when you put your throttle to 0, the motor doesn't get 0. The motor gets 5.5%, which is the default of the full motor drive. And the problem with that is that if you were driving in your car and put your quad backwards out the window and had 100 km/h wind going in backwards, the props are going to spin the wrong way, and the motors are likely
drive
to
it
stop.
backwards. Yeah,
exactly. And once they start going backwards, the ESC is going to desync.
Yeah,
it can't work that out, or it's just going to slow them down so much that when you quickly turn it around and say now go, it's not going to speed up because they're in the low power protection zone, and the ESC is just not going to deliver full power. So ESCs have all these things to prevent them from burning the windings out when they try to start up under load. And all of that is a problem if the motor goes too slow.
And that's fundamentally a problem for our brushless motors, isn't it? Because they're not censored. So there's no sensor on the motor to determine how fast it's going. So when the motor spins too slowly, the ESC can no longer detect where the motor bell is relative to the windings. So
and we've seen lots of logs, and we still keep getting lots of people noticing that they might be flying and they'll do some flips, and then they're really fast flips. When they stop them, the quad has it'll turn around and stop, and then it'll go contouring in some kind of weird wobble. And when we look at the logs, you'll see the motor didn't start up properly. It got 100% drive, and it still didn't really stop the thing properly. And that's a partial desync or a failure to generate thrust. And so, what dynamic idle will do is it won't let that slow motor go so slow that it gets into that hazardous zone. Much, much better than a static idle would. It'll do it perfectly. The new code is unbelievably accurate. You can log RPM and see whether it's accurate or not. But it's really, really good. So what'll then happen is that if you do a flip and you've got motors that have been sort of, imagine it's turning one way, you've got some motors going forward, but others going backwards. These are the ones that you're going to have to spin up to stop it turning, but they've got reverse airflow. So what it's going to do is it'll fix the reverse airflow motors, and they'll be ready to go like that quick. So your flips stop properly. And it also does one other thing that's really fabulous.
Really cool.
So, So the other thing that it does, not only does it let them start up quickly, it allows them to accept no electricity at all, like zero drive, if they've got air coming into them and they're spinning fast enough that they're beating the minimum RPM. So normally if you're flying dead straight ahead and drop the throttle, the thing won't stop very fast because it's always got 5.5% motor drive. Pushing it forward. Now if you're going fast ahead and drop the throttle because you're about to run into somebody, it'll stop that a little bit quicker because the motor drive will all go to 0 until the quad's going slow enough. And that's, you think, well, that's not important, that doesn't matter, but it happens every time you turn. That's speed. If you're a racer and you're turning around corners, you'd be really surprised how slow the RPM gets when you suddenly have to turn, because one motor's got to stop. You've got to rotate the quad around, so it's got to cut its thrust back. So now we can cut thrust truly back to 0.
You get 5% more authority. You just like that.
That's right. That's another way of thinking about it. All of a sudden, the quad's got 5% more ability to turn and to stop and to do what it wants to do. And What's interesting is that some ESCs and some motors are kind of really prone to desyncing, but others aren't. So I've got a 7-inch quad without any fancy gear at all, an old BL Heli ESC. I can run that with dynamic idle at 1,000 RPM and 0 D-shot RPM, basically. Nothing, no fixed throttle offset. And I can flip that and see the propeller blades turning on the slow motors in the sky. You know, I can actually see them going round and round, and it just looks amazing. And it doesn't desync, stops perfectly. So that one, if I put that up in the sky and turn it upside down, the inverted hang time is extraordinary. It just floats. So if you're a line of sight pilot and you just want to show off, like, you know, Warthogs or one of those truly amazing line of sight pilots, you can set your RPM minimum really, really low, and the thing will just float around in the sky and just do whatever you tell it to do. You've got 100% motor authority, and when you've got none, it's just like a butterfly. And that doesn't work so well for us, probably. For racers, what you want is you want to use it like idle up. You want to set the minimum RPM to quite a high number so that the thing kind of never slows down and keep flying. And if you do that, if you set it to 4,000, maybe 4.5, or even 5,000 RPM, then when you say, I'm going to fly along and suddenly chuck a 180, it actually won't do that. It'll fly a little arc around and it will stay in clean air, because the slow motors, it won't pivot on its axis, if you know what I mean. It's like you're holding a bit of push all the time. Now, that's really good for prop wash in 180s, because instead of reversing and going backwards into dirty air, you kind of do a really tight little turn in clean air. Really tight, like 0.5 meter, 1/4 meter, that sort of thing. So not everyone's going to like that, but if you're a racer where you've got a certain turn radius in your spirals, having an idle up in this sense using dynamic idle is remarkable.
You know, something that I've really found a benefit for dynamic idle as well is that when you're sort of dropping from high up and you're falling back down with reverse flow, you do get a risk of the propeller blades, the aerofoils, stalling and losing thrust because of that.
And it wobbles terribly.
And it wobbles terribly, but dynamic idle keeps the blades moving through the air quickly enough that the aerofoil doesn't stall, and so that you get a consistent amount of thrust as you drop into freestyle moves. And so that's why I recommend people run a dynamic idle for freestyle, at least based on how steep pitch their prop is, because a steeper pitch prop needs more RPM to stop the aerofoil stalling. If you run a very light pitch prop, it can go very slowly and still not stall. And I think, you know, what I've found is I think what you've suggested very similar, between 20 for sort of very light pitch props and up as high as 40 or maybe even higher for very steep props gives really great prop wash handling. And you know, without making any other changes, really.
The other thing is that I think also originally we were concerned about the stability of the algorithm, like how well it would control RPM. So we were reluctant to rely on it. I guess that is the truth. So the original advice was to use the dynamic idle kind of as a bit of a floor underneath the normal idle.
Yes, but a backstop.
Yeah, like a backstop. Whereas now, and we had this complicated way you had to set it up, right? So you had to set it a certain way, measure your RPM, and set it to 20, all that sort of stuff.
Yes.
Well, I spent a lot of time flying with 0 D-shot idle.
Yes.
So the way D-shot's used in dynamic idle is it was just sort of like a minimum throttle. It was like, okay, we'll make a halfway bet here. We'll keep a little bit of it on.
Yeah.
A little bit of, I kept turning it to 0. Now, I would have loved to have set the Betaflight to 4.3 to 0, but in the end, it's kind of sits there at 1%. So you never get less than 1%. But in a practical sense, it can be 0. And I'm pretty sure in 4.4, it will be 0. We'll completely rely on the dynamic idle. Now, once you do that and you realize that you don't actually have to stuff around with that D-shot idle value,
It's so
you can
much
do what
easier
we've
to
done
set
in
up.
4.3. So now you don't have to. You just leave your D-shot idle, the 5.5% or 6 or 4 or whatever you've got it at. Just leave that alone. Just use that if you ever turn dynamic idle off. Now what happens when you turn dynamic idle on, all you have to do is set the RPM you want.
Yeah.
And that's all you have to do. Turn it on, set the RPM you want, and go fly. If you haven't got your RPM telemetry working, it won't work. But we've separated that out from the RPM filtering. So if you like, and you don't want to use RPM filtering for any reason, you can still turn on the telemetry and still use dynamic idle without RPM filtering. It'll work just fine. And you can even log RPM using the RPM telemetry without RPM filtering. So people who are not using RPM filtering, who want to learn about what their motors are actually doing, can log RPM for the first time. But I think the main thing with dynamic idle now is it's a lot easier to set up. And we're hopeful anyway that the PIDs controlling it work well. And they do in the main. We may find that some people will find that when they do their flat drops, they'll see a sort of a wobble in the motor traces because the PID controller isn't quite right. You'll see it anyway, that's the problem. Because often when you're dropping in turbulent air, there's a bit of a wobble, so it's a bit hard to know what it is. But we can look at the logs. I've been very impressed by how well it works. I do find on really strong quads, like a lightweight 6S freestyle setup or a race setup, you might want to put the dynamic idle P down from its default of 50 to 40. That's about all I've ever changed, and it's been surprisingly good across a lot of hardware. I've got a lot of confidence in it, and I've flied all the time now. I remember some people said, "Oh, I can't really tell if it makes much of a difference," and well, that's because before it was kind of in a half and half thing. Now it's the whole business. It's 100% dynamic idle. If you don't like it, turn it off. Don't use it, right? But I'm really glad to hear that you also find it good.
Yeah, the 4.3 dynamic idle is a huge step up in my opinion over 4.2. 4.2 was difficult to set up, and if you got it wrong, it would cause low throttle wobbles in my experience. And 4.3, I've had none of that. It just seems to work perfectly. So huge step up. I mean, that's all the questions that I had about Betaflight 4.3. I'll give you the opportunity, Chris, if there's anything that you think I've missed or anything else that you want to talk about that you think is an important feature that people should know about.
Well, I think actually a lot of people these days fly boots, and there is one small thing we've done, and that is that we put Feedforward into level modes and into horizon mode. Now, a lot of people use level race mode, which is a kind of a curious thing where I'm not even sure exactly, but I think what happens is you have self-leveling on pitch. So if you want to go at a certain speed forward, just sort of pitch the nose down a little bit and hold the stick still. And it will assume a certain forward angle and fly around like that. And you just use roll and yaw to do the turning, okay? So what we've got is Feedforward in the level element of that. So what that means is you can tune it up in your PIDs so that when you change that angle, it's instant. Rather than, it uses accelerometer for angle, and that's very slow. It takes a long time. So now actually, it might sound like a tiny thing, but whoop racing is pretty big, and a lot of people do race in level mode. And so all of a sudden,
super competitive as well. Whoop racing is some of the most competitive racing, I think. It's people, because the risks are so low that everyone is on 100% attack all the time.
And it's so much fun too.
And it's so much fun.
You get the visuals of all of the lights. So that's just a tiny thing, but I hope people will enjoy it. The amount of Feedforward is probably going to be different from normal. And too much of it, it may sort of overshoot your target a bit. So you'll have to mess with the amount. I don't even know what it would be. But you've got the option now of using a Feedforward to very quickly assume a certain angle. And when I first started with Betaflight, my first contribution was to make it so horizon mode would actually go inverted and flip and everything. And I actually flew horizon mode for quite a long time because I started off as a line of sight pilot, and I'm hopeless at line of sight. My son's brilliant at line of sight flying. And I love watching him fly. If you ever see a really amazing line of sight pilot, it's just incredible.
It's unbelievable.
He's quite clever at that and a lot of other things. And anyway, so I couldn't do what he did. So I made up horizon mode, which meant that whenever the stick was near the middle, it would fly around kind of docile and level. But if I wanted to flip, it would, as it got more upside down, it would become more acro until when it was fully upside down, it was like an acro chord. So you could go upside down, do inverted hangs and float around, and you could do funnels and all that sort of stuff. And it was actually quite fun. And anyway, that's now got feed forward, so that the feed forward elements in it and in the acro element of it, which wasn't there before, give you, or it's actually really fun. If you've started off flying level mode or you're a flute pilot and you want to get out into 5-inch land, you can go out and fly it with feed forward on and have a ball. So that's a small thing.
Yeah.
I think the other thing is that we've done, there are some fantastic Lua script improvements done by, by Clubfoot, and they're really, really good. Lua is a fantastic way to configure the quad through your radio, and you can use it to transfer back battery voltage and other sorts of things. So yeah, I think that's kind of handy. That's had a lot of work. The OSD has been revised quite a lot. As I say, we've got sliders in the OSD. And we've tried pretty hard also to update Configurator with all the latest changes. Configurator often lagged. At the moment, I think Configurator is right up now with all of the firmware changes. So all the stuff we're talking about goes straight in. People will need to get the latest Configurator.
Yeah.
And they will need to get the latest firmware. And at the moment, we're doing things that sometimes get them a bit out of alignment. So now is probably not the best time to start messing with 4.3. If you're almost certainly going to find there'll be something where you'll make an adjustment in the configurator and it might not actually translate into what you're expecting. So while we're sort of polishing it off, yeah, it's not a really great time to mess with it. On the other hand, it's kind of a fun time to mess with it. So, and I fly it.
Absolutely.
And, yeah. So the only other thing also is, everyone says not to paste a dump into a new build. Okay, not get all your stuff out of 4.2 and just paste it in. And I think that's particularly important with 4.3. Now, we've renamed a lot of parameters. We tried to make it easier for people to find them in the CLI and for us to follow what they are. And that means if you paste in something you've had before, a lot of your old numbers aren't going to go in anyway. Okay, you're just not going to get it. But also, quite a few defaults have changed. So anti-gravity in particular, for instance, now includes a boost on P and has different timing for the I boost. It works way better than before. And some people were pushing anti-gravity up to 9 or 10.
Yeah.
If you do that in 4.3, you're going to get oscillations when you move the throttle quickly because you'll boost your P factor by 2 or 3 or 4 times,
And it'll oscillate.
And it'll oscillate. So the default value for anti-gravity now is all you need. You really shouldn't mess with it unless you're really fussy about that kind of thing and you want to have a look at it in detail. And so there's quite a lot of things like that where it's just not a great plan. It's not even a great plan to put your old PIDs in or your old filter setup. You're better off starting from defaults or from one of the presets. And yeah, so I mean, that's very important. And you can copy over some things like your radio link or your LED setup or other stuff like that. But to be quite honest, it doesn't take long to set up now.
I would say that if people are worried, in my Betaflight 4.3 tuning guide, I do go through some elements that are safe for people to paste in that don't include the things you were saying, like anti-gravity, PIDs, filter settings, but stuff like their OSD and some of the configurations for things like ports and AUX modes and stuff like that that are safe. I provide a guide so people can paste the right stuff in.
Yeah. Oh, there's one other thing that I think that Ivan also did that's just fantastic, and that's the motor configuration tool.
Oh yeah, so, that's awesome. I love it.
How great's that? I could never figure it out. You know, I'd sit there and I'd spin number 1 and number 3 would spin, and then I'd have to look at this like motor stuff in the CLI.
Yeah, it's a nightmare.
That just did my head in. I couldn't make it work.
And now you can get your resources, you can get your motor mapping done and your motor direction done in like 2 minutes. It's awesome.
It's really, really cool. So that's something that we didn't have. That's on the motor tab. And yeah, we can't forget that. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, that's about it, I think, to be honest. Oh, there's one other thing we have forgotten. And it's not a small one. I'm surprised you would let it go, Chris.
Ooh, okay.
There's no more Dmin. It's gone.
Oh.
Yes. Dmin's gone. It's gone the way of the dodo. So, in fact, it's still there. It's just got a different name. It's called D. So, Dmin got a
D and Dmax now. Yeah.
Yeah, we have derivative and Dmax. And the reason for that change in nomenclature is that a lot of people saw Dmin and Dmax, and they didn't know really which was which. What are we flying on? You know, do we fly on the Dmax, the high number? And they see a high number up there, and they think that was the one we had to adjust up or down, but actually not really understood it. So we have made some changes to how that works. So basically, when you're flying, you know, cruising around like I was describing, and all that sort of stuff, the number that your machine flies for D is what we call now derivative, or what used to be called Dmin. That's the working D value that the quad's got kind of nearly all the time.
Yeah.
And the idea is that when you then say, I'm going to spin fast, you get acceleration in you know, physical acceleration of things. And that's kind of harder to stop than kind of relatively slow velocity movements. So what Dmax does is it kind of adds more D to D.
Yes, yeah, boosts it.
Yeah, exactly. And when you think about it, it's an anti-acceleration thing. Okay, so D opposes movement, you know, speed of movement. But if you get the square of D and you add a bit of it back, you actually got something that's anti-acceleration. So that's actually what Dmax does. When you start to go quick into a flip or something like that, it lifts D up to try to better constrain that mechanical momentum that the acceleration part gives.
Yeah.
So it's a bit like feedforward boost is based on the acceleration of the stick position. And we have to have that because of motor lag. And it's what makes feedforward not overshoot. If we didn't have boost, feedforward would overshoot, but feedforward doesn't overshoot. Everyone thought it did. It just basically doesn't. And it wrecks the tuning systems that some people have based on step response. But when you actually look at the behavior of the quad in logs, you find feedforward very rarely actually causes overshoot because of the boost, because we look for when the sticks start to slow down. And the instant we slow down, we pull back so hard on the motors that it's not like P or something. So
and that's why people should turn feedforward off when they're tuning their PD balance, for example, to get a true measure of the response. Yeah,
that's right. You have to turn feedforward off when you're looking to balance P and D. But once you've got the P and D balance, they're actually controlling what happens when you're, say, getting buffeted by wind, or if there's a bit of irregularity in your ESC, or you're, you know, because the ESC control is not perfect, and there are some set point areas for the ESC where they're a bit erratic. So there'll be some places where you're flying straight. That's where your P and D are working. Feedforward does nothing when you're flying straight. Feedforward is what makes the quad move. So overshoot in response to stick inputs, feedforward now actually pretty much doesn't cause that or make that worse.
No.
But your PID controller is trying to I don't know, make the quad follow, or make the quad stay where it is. If you took out the input, your PID controller is making the quad stay straight.
Yeah,
That's what
exactly.
it's really, trying to do. So in fact, kind of a little bit hard. And although I understand that flipping quads to tune P and D is very, very good, and it allows you to get P and D up nice and high. Most of the time when you look at a log, you'll just find D is a real pain in the ass when you move the sticks, because D
It's
tries.
just working against you the whole time.
Yeah, the whole time. That's all it does. It just says, no, I'm not going to let you turn this thing,
No.
and tries to stop it. Right. So that's a pain in the ass. So,
and that's why you need feed forward to
that's why you
basically
need
push and overcome that. Yeah.
And P sits there and deals with the little mess that is left over and tries to keep it perfect. So anyway, so that's the boost side of feed forward, and why feed forward is not the kind of great evil that people think of it when you put input. But we were talking about D, and it's very similar. So what Dmin tried to do, and just got named, I think, a bit funny, we've now called Dmax. So you tune your what we call D now, or derivative. You just tune that with your PID controller. You can set the Dmax to 0, and you're just going to run on D.
Just on D, yeah.
That's right. And if you want to control overshoot, or which a lot you may well want to do, or if for some reason you can't run a lot of D because it's a beat up quad and the bearings are bad, every time you bring D up it gets hot, you can run a bit less D and a bit of Dmax. And then when you do your flips, you won't, D will help control that overshoot, and you won't have that issue that you might have had before, and it will also control P. So it'll make it much harder for P to oscillate if you've got that bit of Dmax, because it often happens in turns. So you can often tell when you haven't got when you got a lot of P and not much D, you'll do a turn, and you'll hear it. You'll hear P fluttering the machine around. And a little bit more D can be very useful in those types of turns to stabilize them. So the idea, so what we changed really is that the difference in default between D and Dmax is now a fair bit smaller. So it's not such a big effect. D itself is a lot higher. It was 26 before. It's like 34 or something, and that doesn't sound a big difference, but it's a big difference.
It's a big difference, yeah.
It's a big difference. So we've got that's quite a big change. If you're looking for Dmin, you won't find it in 4.3.
No, but the functionality, I think, as you said, you've explained, is still the same, but it's just named in a more intuitive way.
Yes, it's named in a more intuitive way so that people will change the right number when they're thinking through it. And personally, I would strongly recommend kind of leaving it where it is, because just tune it the way it is. The little extra bit of D that you get in those fast movements, it's a good thing. And I've done quite a lot of logging. Most of the basement tuning methods don't involve really a massive acceleration of the quad. They're small, sticky movements. So what Dmax fundamentally does now, for a standard freestyle setup, is it helps control overshoot when you do a big flip or a sudden, quick, dramatic movement. And for racers, it's actually really quite useful for that. Racers are often turning one way and then suddenly reversing the other way. So that's where having a bit of Dmax and not having to have a whole lot of D the rest of the time is really good.
Particularly if you're running a lot of feed forward. If you're running a lot of feed forward, Dmax can be really helpful for controlling the tendency of a lot of feed forward to make. Sometimes you get things happening at the end of sharp flips and rolls where the feed forward turn actually pushes too hard in the other direction. Dmax can be helpful in those situations if you're running a lot of feed forward, but honestly, for my freestyle quads, I don't tend to find that I'm running so much feed forward that tends to happen. But some people
are you tending to move the feed forward slider down a little bit, or leaving it there?
No, I tend to move it up. I typically run very high. I typically run more feed forward than most, I think, to get really good stick tracking, set point tracking through fast moves, so that the gyro and the set point line up. And I find that as I move my PID gains up, as I move my D gains up particularly, the more D gain I have, the more feed forward I have to put on to overcome the D term when I push into sharp moves. And so I can often get feed forwards up in the 300, 400 range quite easily.
Really? Wow.
Yeah, running Ds of 50 or 60.
Wow.
And so in those situations, running those very high feed forwards, sometimes it can be good to have a bit of Dmax in those sharp moves to help, as you say, just keep everything under control, keep the momentum under control.
Wow. Wow. I mean, what's really exciting is to see guys like yourself and Mark Spatz and Brian White all tuning things to a very high level now. The tools that you've got now, especially those tools of Brian's, where you can look at the step response and you can take the feed forward off, take the eye out, and just sit there and very carefully get that as high as you can get it, and have a listen, check your motor temperatures. You can tune these things really incredibly well. And I'm kind of staggered how much higher they can generally get them above defaults. There's no way I could have put those kind of numbers onto quads before 4.3.
No,
we haven't changed the gain. That's what people need to be aware of. It's not like we cheated here and I don't know, turned the internal multiplier for P and D down or anything. It's still the same P and D. It's just you can run it at 45, 50, 60,
even higher. Yeah.
Well, no, I can't. Not on my ones.
Only if you've got very clean props.
you need a good frame, and I can't emphasize enough the need to have a frame that doesn't resonate. I had a lot of trouble with a 7-inch build that I had from the point of view of stability and forward flight. I'd look at the GoPro footage and it just had this little kind of jitter in it, all the time, because I had a unstabilized GoPro, and it just was wandering around, and I tried everything. And of course, eventually I bolted the frame to a table.
Yes.
And spun the motors up, and I could see that the arms and the motors were flexing. There was a kind of you could simply see the props at some points, all 4 motors together, something would happen. They'd ring together, they'd be at similar frequencies, but not quite exactly the same. And the thing would start to precess a little bit, and the tips of the props you could see were no longer like on a flat disc, and the thing would shake. And of course, if you get your motors and bolt them to a cement slab, you can put one-bladed propeller on them.
Yeah, of course.
Nothing will happen. So the stiffer the frame and the firmer everything is mounted, so that the resonant frequencies are outside what we're interested in, and so that the arm won't twist so much, and so that the prop blades can't precess around and the whole thing start to go like it would go on a jelly bean. Well, once you get them stiff like that, all of a sudden I could put any PIDs I liked on that frame.
Yeah.
And when it was soft, it was really hard. So I think frame design, and I know you've thought about this a great deal, and I know you have interest in that.
It's my top priority whenever I design a frame is the resonance performance. It's just number one for me.
Yeah. Well, once you've got a frame like that, they're just so much easier to tune. And if you've got a frame that's got resonance, it just drives you. It's awful. Yeah. Awful. All right. Well, we agree on a lot of things here.
We definitely, Chris. It's been wonderful talking to you. I have just enjoyed it beyond belief, and I'm sure that everyone else who will watch this video when I upload it will enjoy it hugely as well. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you as well for everything that you do for the community, with all the work that you do for Betaflight. I'm so happy to be able to have the opportunity to speak with you, and also show people some of the really clever features of the new version of Betaflight. And all the hard work that you and all the other contributors and developers on the project do as well. So thank you very much for that.
I would like to emphasize that congratulating me is probably kind of a little bit unfair to the people who do all the stuff. I probably contribute less than probably less than 1% of the worthwhile stuff in that code base. Probably less than that. I've done a lot of the flight related stuff, but really none of what I do is a candle to what so many of the other guys do. And I have to tell you, for if you put this code on your quad and go off and fly it, I don't think anyone really understands the magnitude of the task and how many people it's burned out. We've had some people get really seriously burned out by the constant pressure of the thing, by a constant flood of people saying this doesn't work or that doesn't work, and you guys all suck, and people making YouTube videos who say that we're assholes. You know what I mean?
Dear.
And it's really, really hard. And so we've lost some really good people because of burnout and because, it never stops. And Betaflight doesn't stop. Anyone who thought that we weren't doing anything this year and a half, they don't have a clue.
It's been intense. It's been intense. I know. I'm only sort of peripherally aware of all the work that goes on the Slack channel and all the testing, but people are working on it every day, so hard, and a huge.
So our goal is to get it out for Christmas this year, certainly in a final and viable state. We got about 2 weeks to do it now, and I'm not sure we can. I really hope so. It's our Christmas present to everyone who flies a reasonable piece of hardware, right? And I'm not sure really we're going to ever have as big a step forward as 4.3. We've really changed an incredible number of things, right? Through from the signal coming in from the radio, all the way through to how we control the motors, to how we set the quad up, to how we let people customize the quad, how we do all of the little nitty-gritty things and how we do them under the hood, and all of that stuff that Steve did with it. It's really like Betaflight 10 or something. If this was an Apple computer, this would be OS X or something. You know what I mean?
I know. This is a big step forward.
The biggest change that we've ever done. And it's a whole lot of integrated things that just work fabulously. So I'm very proud of it. I know that, Mike Keller, who has really done the most fantastic job of running the show and keeping me under control. Bruce Luckcuck, who set up so much of the groundwork for us and so many of the great things. Jay Blackman, who kind of looks after organizing things and the infrastructure of the websites. All of these guys are invisible to the average person, but
making a huge contribution.
Yeah, well, we've got a whole bunch of people that we couldn't function really without, and some of them have to take a break because it's just really hard work. And I don't really know how much longer I keep doing it, because you get kind of frustrated when you spend the whole of a Sunday and it's perfect flying weather and you're trying to get the code ready for other people to fly. It's a weird feeling. I don't know why I do it sometimes. But I think when I see the smiles on people's faces and when I hear how happy people are flying it, and that's what it's about for us. I think when we're all pilots, every single one of the developers flies, and we all fly pretty competitively or with enthusiasm, and so that's what makes it great. I think it's not being developed by people for money. We don't get paid or anything. If you donate something, we get some flight controllers to check, and maybe at Christmas time we get a little bonus or something if there's any money left over, but we got to pay for servers and for infrastructure and for hardware testing equipment and all this sort of stuff, analyzers. So really, it's really just done because we're pilots and we enjoy flying. And when it flies great, it just feels so good.
If anyone wants to donate to the Betaflight program, I'll put a link down below in the video description to where you can do that.
Yeah, and if we just love getting good feedback, I think that's what we love. If you fly really well and you've used our code, just pop a little and say thank you in the YouTube video or whatever. And,
that would be wonderful.
That makes us feel good, when people give us that kind of feedback. Absolutely. Say a big thank you to Ivan every time you put a preset on.
Absolutely, yeah.
Every time those little dynamic notch filters work, you owe something to Jan.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time, Chris. Thank you to you. Thank you to everyone else in the project, all the developers, all the testers, everyone who contributes. yeah, very excited for 4.3 and all that it brings. Yeah,
Right.
it's going to be
Thank you for
awesome.
the opportunity to have a word with you, and I appreciate very much what you do.
Oh, you're very, very kind, and I feel exactly the same. So, so thank you, and I think we'll leave it here for today. And I hope that everyone enjoys this, and all the information that you've given us.
If they lasted to the end,
if they've lasted to the end, then they're fantastic, doing fantastically well. And thank you for sticking with it.
Okay, well, thumbs up for everyone for Christmas. Have a wonderful Christmas and enjoy Betaflight when we get out for you.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, Merry Christmas to you as well. Take care.
Yeah, and to you. Bye.
Bye-bye. I hope you'll agree that that was a really awesome insight into all of the changes that are coming up in Betaflight 4.3. I think it's going to be a real step change in flight performance for a lot of pilots. I know a lot of you are using Betaflight 4.3 already and loving it, whether it's for freestyle, racing, long range, all of that. If you'd like to support the Betaflight project, I'll put a link down in the video description to where you can do that. But whether or not you support financially, I know that all the contributors to the Betaflight project, the devs, the testers, all of the contributors will really appreciate any positive feedback that you want to give them following your testing of Betaflight 4.3 on your own quads. That's, I think, really what gets them out of bed in the morning, and why they invest so much time in this wonderful firmware is for the benefit of everyone in the community. So if you have the opportunity, show them some love. That's all I have for you for today. So until next time, I wish you all very, very happy flying.